Sorry about that. There's a bit of a problem with, or well, you don't know that actually, because you didn't know the challenges I went through. Anyway, this is Unit 3 still. Welcome back to AP World History. This is Unit 3, Chapter 2, The Scientific Revolution. So we're going to pay attention to an event in European history known as the Scientific Revolution. We're going to define what that means in just a second, but your bell work on the screen, identify and explain one similarity and one difference between the Protestant and counter or Catholic Reformation. So we are going to look at the scientific revolution today. And this is a time period in European history when we are going to see a profound interest in science. And as a result of that, we will see a lot of scientific, intellectual, or I should say scientific, technological, and philosophical advances, as we're just going to see in just a second. The lesson objective is very similar to last presentation's lesson objective. It's this idea of continuity and change within various systems of belief. In this case, we're going to define systems of belief as philosophy, as kind of that idea of intellectual development. So pay attention to when I mention intellectual changes. That's going to be the most obvious. But more importantly, pay attention to continuity. We are going to see continuity, especially in that idea that who is making these intellectual developments, largely going to still be very rich people, and for the most part, men. So let's look at what exactly the scientific revolution is before we pay attention to some discoveries during that time. Well, the scientific revolution, it is going to be this period in European history in which we are going to see rapid advances in science and technology. Basically, we are going to see the groundwork, the foundations of our more modern understanding of science. We are going to see a profound advancement of secular intellectualism during the scientific revolution. So it generally is going to be this time period of rapid advances in science and technology that will, as we will see in a second, make Europe one of the leading centers of science and technological development in the world. So that's one of the big changes right there. We are going to see that Europe will rapidly advance as a major society in terms of technological and scientific advances. And we are going to see profound interest in different scientific fields. For example, the scientific revolution will begin with astronomy, the study of the stars and planets and the moon and the sun and all those things in the sky. We also see advances in physics. We see advances in chemistry, unfortunately. We see advances in biology. So we are going to see largely that the scientific revolution is focused on the natural sciences, meaning the sciences that relate to nature and how nature works, basically. So why is the scientific revolution going to happen? Well, why does anything happen? Well, let's see why the scientific revolution will happen. And we're going to first explore, well, all of these things actually we've already talked about ever since Unit 1, as we're going to see. But for one thing, we are going to see that the Renaissance is going to be one of these causes of the scientific revolution. Some historians even say that the Renaissance was during or I should say the scientific revolution took place during the Renaissance. But for our sake, we're going to say that they're separate events, and that the scientific revolution is going to be kind of the birth child of the Renaissance. Remember, the Renaissance wasn't just a time of fancy art and fancy clothing, but it was a time of profound philosophical advances. It was a time period in which there was an interest in the natural world, an interest in scientific development. But the scientific revolution is going to continue these ideas. It is going to largely expand on those initial interests in science. And one of the big influences of the Renaissance on the scientific revolution is the idea of secularism. Remember secularism, that idea kind of developed during the Renaissance? It's the idea that perhaps maybe religion isn't the sole explanation for the natural world. Maybe there are forces at play that don't come from the divine world, from the spiritual realm. So the idea of secularism, in conjunction with kind of Renaissance interest in understanding the natural world, these are intellectual roots for the scientific revolution. And even with the art stuff, remember, these artistic developments during the Renaissance, they depicted very realistic human forms. And these very realistic human forms, well, they were based on an understanding of anatomy, of biology, of how human beings look in different stances. But another development that we've already talked about that will be a cause of the scientific revolution is the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation will impact the scientific revolution in two ways. For one thing, the Protestant Reformation opened the doors for anybody to criticize the Catholic Church. During the Protestant Reformation, that criticism was largely about religion. But thanks to the kind of opening of the doors, this kind of entryway for other people to start criticizing the Catholic Church, we also start to see people criticizing the Catholic Church's hold over education, over intellectual developments, over their interpretation of science. So we are going to see that the Protestant Reformation is giving the possibility for other criticisms of Catholic teachings as they relate to science. But in Northern European countries, this is where we will see a lot more of these scientific developments in places like England, as we'll talk about. Hello? Hello? All right. In places like England, as we'll talk about. But also remember the Protestant Reformation in Protestant countries at the very least, it did open the doors for higher literacy. Remember, a big part of Protestant theology is individual interpretation of the Bible. And in order to individually interpret the Bible, you need to know how to read it. So this ability to read and write, that's going to open up the possibility to read and write about things other than religion, things related to science, for example. But another development we've already talked about is that idea of intellectual and cultural exchanges with the Middle East. Remember, the Middle East, or the Islamic world in general, as we might call it, was a place, a region of profound scientific discovery. We talked about the Islamic Golden Age way back in Unit 1. And the Islamic Golden Age, remember, that was itself a time period of profound interest in science and technology. So we are going to see that kind of, as a result of trade connections, that these ideas from the Middle East are making their way into Europe. And there are some more specific examples of this Islamic European kind of exchanges. For example, remember how Greco-Roman science, that idea of kind of using empiricism, that idea of using evidence to support a claim, that is something very much discussed during both the classical era, but also during the Islamic Golden Age. Remember, the Islamic Golden Age, part of the kind of cause of that was interest in Greco-Roman science, in Greco-Roman writing and sculpture and art. So we do see that kind of this will carry over to Europe thanks to these cultural exchanges as a result of trade. But even more specific ideas, even more specific scientific theories, they are also going to be transferred to Europe thanks to these intellectual exchanges as a result of trade. For one thing, we do see actually a profound influence of a certain Islamic astronomer on the findings of European thinkers. For example, we see that best expressed in the figure of Nasir al-Din Tusi. And Tusi was an Persian scholar, so he's a Muslim scholar. And he's going to actually develop what is known as the heliocentric model of the universe. So the heliocentric model, essentially, it believes that the sun, helio, is in the centric, of the solar system, of the universe as humans understood it at the time. So we are going to see that the heliocentric model is first discovered in the Islamic world. Same thing with algebra, same thing with these ideas. But we do see that this heliocentric model is going to be utilized by and discussed and debated by European philosophers, or I should say scientists. All right, so Nazir al-Din Tusi, we talked about him in Unit 1, a little bit in Unit 2. All right, let's keep going. But why specifically will the scientific revolution happen in Europe? Well, that is something that your textbook actually is going to talk about a little bit. So it is important to kind of get an understanding of this particular historical interpretation. I don't necessarily agree with it because I feel it downplays kind of the significance of Islamic and Chinese science, but nonetheless, it is an interpretation that might be helpful to consider. So why is Europe going to be the center of this scientific revolution? Why not the Middle East? Why not China? Well, actually, your textbook makes the argument that for much of European history, Europe was decentralized, and that is true. But how is this impacting intellectual developments? Well, because of this decentralization, there really wasn't a single institution that would regulate what is taught at a university, at a place of learning. Unlike with, say, the Middle East, which had various Islamic empires, or China, which had a fairly unified, definitely centralized government. So, because of this decentralization, there was a lot of intellectual independence of thought in these universities, places like Oxford in England, places like Salamanca in Spain, places like the University of Paris in, well, France. So, the ability to kind of pursue whatever the heck you wanted at these colleges, that is going to be a big kind of reason why we will see the scientific revolution. Because the only institution that might have regulated intellectual developments at these places was the Catholic Church. But with the Protestant Reformation, and this is important to understand, with the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church's power over education has been severely questioned. So we are going to see a lot of independent thinking at these universities. We do not see what we call dogmatic thinking. And dogmatic thinking is the opposite of independent thinking. It is following kind of blindly the rules and ideas of a certain religion, for example. But this contrasts, this kind of independence of thought in these European universities contrasts with the political situation of the Islamic world. And remember, the Islamic world is not necessarily one single country, but more kind of similar societies in the Middle East and beyond. Well, we do kind of see this dogmatic thinking in Islamic universities and Chinese universities. At these Islamic universities, we mostly do see this idea of, or I should say, these universities are largely focused on religious education, on studying the Quran, for example. Whereas Chinese institutions of learning, they were mostly focused on the teachings of Confucius, on Neo-Confucianism specifically. So we do kind of see that these places with more centralized governments had a lot more of this dogmatic religious and philosophical thinking. And that any advances that were made during the Islamic Golden Age, say, or during intellectual periods like the Song Dynasty in China, that these mostly came as a result of, well, people outside of government-controlled institutions, out of private individuals, of scientists and scholars who received kind of individual patronage. So we do kind of see that this idea of decentralization led to independent thought, which in turn was different from, say, the Middle East and China. I don't know if I agree with this interpretation because I feel it's kind of saying, the Middle East and China, they're so traditional, they don't know how to adapt to the current world. I don't agree with that necessarily, but it is an interpretation nonetheless. So we talked a lot about causes, and we talked basically what the scientific revolution was, but what are some discoveries made during that? So the scientific revolution will actually kick off in astronomy, and it largely is going to be a area where we will see a major advancement in the model of the universe. Because we are going to see that al-Din Tusi, or Nazir al-Din Tusi, his ideas are going to be actually expanded on, improved by European scholars, at least indirectly. Copernicus is never going to outright claim that he copied from Nazir al-Din Tusi, but historical evidence kind of shows he might have. Anyway, who is Copernicus? Because I just mentioned him. Well, Copernicus was a Polish priest slash scientist. He kind of held both jobs. And he is going to be a astronomer part-time, basically. And using kind of mathematical theories, using kind of the evidence that Nazir al-Din Tusi talked about, we are going to see that Copernicus is going to, in his book, The Observations of the Heavenly Bodies, it is going to prove that there is the heliocentric model of the universe, that the sun, rather than the earth, is the center of the solar system. So let me just kind of, I guess we have a model right here. So this right here in the bottom is actually Copernicus's drawing as it relates to the heliocentric model of the universe. So we have the sun in the center. We've got the planets around the sun. Wow, that's amazing. And this is different from, say, the geocentric model of the universe, where the Earth, right here, is in the center of the solar system, and that things like the sun, that's my picture of the sun, went around the Earth. That's the geocentric model, or the geo-Earth-centric model. However, Copernicus's ideas are radical for a reason that might not be so clear. So, Copernicus's ideas challenge two long-standing institutions in Europe. It challenges, on the one hand, the already established scientific theory of Europe at the time, and that was the geocentric model. So, the geocentric model of the universe, at least in the Western world, was talked about by this Greek scholar named Ptolemy. Ptolemy, he was technically from Egypt. He was from Alexandria, actually. But Ptolemy is going to say that the Earth is in the center of the solar system. And this was a widely held belief in Western Europe, really, until the 1500s, wherein we do see that Copernicus will prove once and for all that, in fact, no, the heliocentric model is the correct one. So he's disproving this classical era thinker. And guess what? He's also challenging the Catholic Church. Because according to the Catholic Church, at least in the Bible, it says that the sun goes around the Earth, that it's the geocentric model of the universe, of the solar system, actually. So kind of Copernicus's ideas will pose a little bit of a heretical threat to the Catholic Church. However, we are going to see that Copernicus's ideas, as controversial as they are going to be discussed about with other scientists. And we do kind of see that one of the big impacts of the scientific revolution is the idea of intellectual discussion and discussion over theory, this exchange of ideas between scientists to perfect theories. And Copernicus's ideas will kind of be discussed by other philosophers, or I should say other scientists as well. In the Danish world, in the German-speaking parts of Denmark, we see Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. These guys, they're going to kind of note the rotation of the planets around the sun. They're going to also support this heliocentric model. That's really all you would need to know about them. Any scientists out there, you're going to criticize me for the rough summation of their accomplishments. But the most important astronomer who is going to face a lot of criticism, as we'll see in a second, for basically proving that Copernicus, that all these guys were right, is going to be an Italian astronomer named Galileo Galilei. Magnifico, no. Galileo, well, who was he? Well, he was an Italian astronomer who is going to prove the heliocentric model, not just all the math stuff, but by using a new and improved technology, I should say more improved technology, the improved technology of the telescope. So Galileo is going to use the telescope to not only prove that, in fact, Copernicus was right, but also the fact that, hey, guess what? Did you know other planets have moons? Did you know that there are other kind of planets out there other than just the ones we can see with our naked eye? So we are going to see that the heliocentric model will be proven, but new ideas as well will be discussed by Galileo. And yet, we are going to see that Galileo, largely because he lives in northern Italy in Pisa, he's right next door to the center of the Catholic Church of Rome. And guess what? Well, Galileo is going to face criticism for his ideas by the Catholic Church. He is going to be censored. He is going to be forced to a trial, basically. And he is going to be forced by the church to say that his ideas were fake and wrong and that he's sorry, basically. So if we're thinking about that idea of continuity, in Catholic countries at least, in places like the Italian city-states, we do see that there is going to be a still important role of the Catholic Church over matters of education. And that's true in Catholic places like Portugal and Spain and in the Italian city-states as well. So there's a continuity right there. We do see that there is going to be a continued importance of the church over matters of education, at the very least in Catholic countries. All right, so enough about that. That's a good video. This is a funny video. We're not going to watch it. So what other developments are going to be made? And we're going to actually now turn our attention to the other fields of science. We are going to look at a little bit in biology, chemistry, and physics. And you wouldn't need to know exactly kind of the very minute details of what these guys discovered, but you would need to know kind of how they are proving their theories, their discoveries. Because these scientists that we're going to talk about in a second, they are going to employ ideas of observation, of noting results, of experimentation to support a conclusion. And that's one of the biggest kind of contributions of the scientific revolution in world history is going to be the development of a new way to prove scientific theories, and that is the scientific method. And if you've ever done an experiment in any science class, you did the scientific method. You formed a hypothesis, or at least were given one. You formed a hypothesis. You measured things, you noted observations, you noted kind of conditions of your experiment, you noted the evidence. And at the very end of all of it, you kind of used your observations, you used evidence to support a conclusion. So we do kind of see that the scientific method is going to be developed during the scientific revolution. This will assist in making new innovations, new scientific breakthroughs in the future. So what are some examples of these scientists in other fields? Well, for one thing, you've got William Harvey, who developed the circulatory system, or at least the theory of the circulatory system. No, he did not literally invent the process by which blood is pumped throughout the body. So he is going to prove that, in fact, there are more complicated biological things going on within the human body. But in terms of kind of how the scientific method is being used in chemistry, for example, we have Robert Boyle. Boyle is going to develop kind of our more modern understanding, the more formal understanding of the scientific method. He's going to use that in his chemistry experiments. So the scientific method, just to kind of review what it is this idea of using logic, reason, evidence, observations to support a fact. And that kind of shows a continuity with Greek and Roman scholarship, with Greek and Roman observation. Other scientists will contribute to kind of the formation of the scientific method. Francis Bacon is one example. Francis Bacon is going to kind of add on to the scientific method in developing a related concept of scientific empiricism. Essentially, empiricism is the idea that You use empirical data or evidence to prove a conclusion. So we do kind of see that Bacon will also utilize this very sensible step-by-step rationale process to prove a scientific theory. Bacon is a little funny because one of his experiments supposedly is that he discovered that freezing meat preserves it longer. And he does that by killing a chicken and then throwing it out into a blizzard. And then, hey, guess what? The meat's still good after all that exposure to below freezing temperatures. Then he died because he got pneumonia from being out of the cold. Anyway, that's a little funny. And finally, kind of one last figure, one last example is Isaac Newton. Newton, you might have heard of him before. He invented gravity. No, he noted the gravitational pull of certain objects. But other than that, he developed calculus. Well, there's some controversy there. Some guy named Leibniz might have done that, but whatever. We're gonna take a Newton invented calculus stance on this channel. We see kind of the development of physics ideas, gravity, one of them. And Newton is important kind of the broader span of world history because he is going to introduce a new model of how the universe works, basically. And we call this the Newtonian model or Newtonian physics, basically. So we do kind of see that there are new explanations for the world around us based on reasoned, observed processes. And Newton's ideas actually will be a major continuity in European history because they're going to be the mainstay for scientific thought really until the 20th century with Albert Einstein. So you should be able to identify some discoveries made during the scientific revolution. So before we conclude today, we first got to look at some of the results of the scientific revolution. Other than all these new discoveries, what are other results of the scientific revolution? Well, for one thing, kind of thinking about broader world history, well, we are going to see that the West, specifically Western Europe, is going to become one of the leaders of intellectual developments, intellectual ideas in science especially. We will see Europe kind of come toe-to-toe, you could say, with Middle Eastern scholarship, with Chinese scholarship. Although Europeans, of course, think that they're better than everybody. But we do kind of see that the West is becoming a leading center of science, that Europe is becoming a leading center of science. And we kind of see that there is this celebration of scientific genius, much like we saw during the, much like we saw during the Renaissance, where there's the celebration of artistic genius. We're seeing the celebration of intellectual genius, of scientific and philosophical genius. So we do kind of see more advances in science as a result of this atmosphere of actually kind of giving a fig about science. And I said fig, F-I-G. All right. But we talked about scientific developments, but what about technological ones? Well, there are a few. Mostly they are going to be improvements on already existing technologies. For example, the telescope. The telescope, I can't remember where it was developed, but Galileo, he is going to improve upon it and use it in astronomy. But the use of the telescope is obviously not limited to just astronomy. It's going to be used in exploration as well. We also see that this is a time period of the use of chemistry to improve gunpowder technology. We will see better gunpowder units, basically, better gunpowder devices, better weapons, the musket, for example. So we will see improved gunpowder weapons. And this is going to give Europe a bit of an edge when it comes to, well, future developments that we'll talk about more in Unit 4. But what else do we got? Well, we also see that there will be increased sponsorship of different educational institutions by the secular government, or I should say by the government. So we mostly see this because there is this idea that, hey, science can be used at our advantage. We can prove our superiority over other countries by rapidly advancing in science and technology. So we will see kind of a political motivation for increased government kind of sponsorship of educational institutions, of these universities, these educational institutions of higher learning. So we do kind of see that science is going to be realized as something that can be manipulated for the purposes of a state, for the purposes of a country. But another big impact of the scientific revolution is something that we have to think about in the future. That is the Industrial Revolution. Because by the end of the scientific revolution, by the end, so closer to the 1700s, in the 1700s actually, we will see the development of new technologies like the steam engine, which is very important when we discuss the Industrial Revolution. But in general, not even these specific inventions, you can kind of credit to the Industrial Revolution, but the basic idea of technological innovation, that is something that will lend itself towards the Industrial Revolution. But another big result of the scientific revolution is going to be another intellectual movement, and that intellectual movement is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is something we will come across a time and time again in Unit 4, in Unit 5, but in Unit 6, and also in Unit 7 as well. So we will come across the Enlightenment quite a bit, but what is it, and how is it a result of the scientific revolution? Well, in a nutshell, the Enlightenment essentially is a time period in which we will see it's a period of philosophical growth, where we are going to see the application of reason and logic into philosophy. We already saw that in terms of science with the scientific revolution, but that idea is going to be transferred over to philosophy during the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is going to kind of say several things, as we'll talk about in a second, but in general, it's going to have a very optimistic outlook on humanity and society and as a whole. It's the idea that society and nature are rational. And because they are rational, we can understand them, and because we can understand them, we can improve nature and society in general. So there's this idea of improvement during the Enlightenment. We see generally this idea that the world is governed by rational, scientific, almost means. But what is causing the Enlightenment? Well, there are 4 explanations. One of the big kind of beliefs of the Enlightenment, as we're going to see in a second, is religious tolerance and freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. And it's mostly going to come as a result of people kind of being disgusted with the intellectual, or I should say the religious conflicts as a result of the Reformation. People are killing each other because they believe in different interpretations of the Bible. That's ridiculous, according to these Enlightenment thinkers. So we do kind of see that there is this idea that, hey, we need to move away from religion, not just in terms of science and education, but also in terms of politics and social relations as well. So we do kind of see that this disgust of these Reformation religious wars, that's going to lead to ideas of, hey, maybe we should become a secular society. Naturally, the scientific revolution, with its insistence on using reason and logic to prove a scientific claim, that's going to also be developed during the Enlightenment. Let's apply reason and logic to philosophy. And finally, 2 other ones. For one thing, we see that these universities that are propped up by the government, they are flourishing grounds for these intellectual movers and shakers of the Enlightenment. And finally, another explanation actually is the rise of capitalism, because one of the biggest Enlightenment era supporting groups is actually going to be the middle class, is actually going to be the new emerging merchant class. And they're called the middle class because up here, we've got the nobles who control society at this point still, even though their power is declining. In the middle, we've got really rich merchants, who aren't nobles, but aren't exactly the poorest people ever. And then on bottom, we've got everybody else. We've got the peasants. We've got the urban workers. But why is the rise of capitalism? Well, mostly because the rise of capitalism leads to a new class, the merchant class or middle class or bourgeoisie, as we'll talk about later. And this new bourgeoisie, they are going to gravitate towards Enlightenment ideas, as we'll see in a second, of property rights. But let's talk about that more just now, actually. So, what are some Enlightenment beliefs? These are important things to understand. We'll come back to them more in Unit 5. Well, for one thing, the Enlightenment is going to be a time period in which there is this argument that society needs to be non-religious or secular. So there is going to be this Enlightenment era thought on secularism, that we need to move beyond religion. We've moved past the need for religion, basically. However, remember, there is still a very big importance on religion in many of these societies. These Enlightenment thinkers, they're not government leaders, at least not just yet. So we are going to see that despite this kind of ideas of secularism, no one's a profound or a professed atheist other than, say, well, we'll talk about him later on, but Voltaire. So really like one person. So we do kind of see a big change in this idea of deism. Deism essentially is a way to kind of rationalize religion, to make it more reasonable and logical. Deism essentially is the idea that God is a logical person. God is a watchmaker. That God set up a watch, the universe, and basically left it alone to run by itself. That's kind of what the theory of deism is. It's the idea that God is a rational human being and he rules through rational laws and not just because he hates people. But we also see that because of this decreased importance of religion among Enlightenment philosophers, that there is going to be this idea of hell, or there's not going to be this idea of hell, but there is going to be this idea that we need to have religious freedom, freedom of not only religion, but freedom not to believe in a religion. So we do see that religious tolerance, and in a more radical sense, complete separation from religion. These are some ideas emerging during the Enlightenment. Another big idea is going back to that idea that society can be improved, because the Enlightenment is going to very much believe that society is what we call a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. The idea that society and people, they aren't perfect, but when people are born, they are a blank slate, and society imprints upon a blank slate. So if we as people can provide the best conditions, say education, we can make the world a rational and better place. So there is this idea that we can improve society and individuals, even if that means making a political change, a revolution, you could say. So definitely, as we'll see in the future, the Enlightenment is going to sponsor a lot of, or it's going to be a motivating factor in a lot of revolutions that we'll talk about more in Unit 5. Generally, we see this idea that logic and facts, these need to be the ideas that form a conclusion. But finally, one of the political ideas of the Enlightenment is the concept of natural rights. And what are natural rights? Well, natural rights essentially are rights or privileges that are given to everybody merely by the fact that they are born, merely by the fact that they are human beings. So natural rights, they include things like, well, you might have heard of these: life, liberty, and the property. Life, liberty, property. Those are the three big natural rights, according to a guy named John Locke, who we'll talk about in the next chapter. So the idea of natural rights is going to be a major, major notion in European Enlightenment thinking. And that idea of that property and the right to obtain it is a natural right. That's why merchants like the Enlightenment, as we'll see much more in Unit 5. All right, so you should be familiar with these ideas of the Enlightenment. We'll discuss the Enlightenment more later. We'll especially see kind of how even there are female Enlightenment philosophers who believe that women deserve natural rights. And that actually brings me to another important point, and that relates to the idea of continuity. that while all of these intellectual developments are happening, both during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, they mostly are reserved to very rich, very elite men. And as we'll talk about more with Unit 4, white men. All right, so let's keep going. So these are some Enlightenment thinkers. This is Denis Diderot. He wrote the Encyclopedia. It was basically, well, what an encyclopedia is, but it is showing this interest by Enlightenment thinkers in the natural world. How do we document and preserve our knowledge? René Descartes, he was he was born in France, I think, but he lived a long time in the Netherlands. Anyway, he's going to have this theory that humans are humans because they have the ability to think. There's the famous phrase, he might not have said it, but the famous phrase of, I think, therefore I am. And finally, we've got Voltaire right here. Voltaire is a very funny guy. He is actually that exception to the rule that most Enlightenment thinkers were atheists, or not atheists, I should say. Because Voltaire straight up was, even though it was a crime in France where he lived. We do see that Voltaire is going to be a very aggressive supporter of religious freedom and opponent to religious dogma, religious kind of interpretation of Scripture, a very kind of strict interpretation of Scripture, what's in the Bible. Voltaire, he famously on his deathbed was given the possibility to convert to Catholicism, but he essentially said, no, thank you. I don't want to make enemies with God, basically. Yeah, so that's Voltaire right there. He used to drink like 50 cups of coffee every day. So you should be able to identify kind of the string, the logic of this idea of how different things cause the different intellectual movements. For one thing, how did the Renaissance influence the scientific revolution? And then finally, how did the Reformation and the scientific revolution influence the Enlightenment? All right, so I leave you there. Have a pleasant day. Have a great, grand old day. And keep safe, I guess. Bye-bye.